So this is the last of the major portfolios here that we're going to talk about after transportation, after energy efficiency, and so this is renewable power. The portfolio here is solar, PV, and CSP. It's photovoltaics, system integration, soft costs issues relative to solar, manufacturing, and I'll just make a note here. I'm going to mention this several times as we go through. These programs, they sound like somewhat linear, perhaps siloed programs. They're not. We have significant crosscuts across the portfolios. When we talk about manufacturing, the solar office works heavily with Mark's office in advanced manufacturing and so on. Wind and water is one office combined together right now. It's both onshore and offshore wind. And then in the water program, it's traditional hydro, new forms of hydropower. Interestingly, and I think it's a very, very cool set of technologies, marine hydrokinetics, waves, tidal, and so on. And then finally, geothermal, both hydrothermal systems is where we've got fractured rock and fluid flow, and enhanced geothermal, and Ruben mentioned this a little bit this morning. And then also some interesting areas that sort of go to how do you add value to hot fluids, low temperature, co-produced, direct use, and then also trying to get interesting materials and metals out of these brines. I wanted to talk a little bit about people as well. So we got in this portfolio, we've got 3 directors. None of them were here, by the way. Lydia Sakarik, she's the acting director in solar. Background in applied physics from Cornell, AAAS fellow. Very fun background. Jose Zayas, mechanical engineering from New Mexico and from UC Davis. And previously was at Sandia before coming to DOE. Sue Ham, she's the acting director in geothermal. Sue's got a background in geophysics, material science, a lot of work in the security and defense side of things, and she joined us not too long ago from NSF. And the reason I'm talking about this is what are the pathways, and I encourage you to talk to folks here. How do folks end up at DOE? What are their pathways? And I'd say in very many cases they're nonlinear pathways coming to this place. I also want to introduce, there's a handful of folks from the portfolio here. Margaret Schaus previously was introduced. Margaret has both her degrees from Stanford. Kevin Lind, who's responsible for the grid integration program at EERE. Joe Steckley in the solar program, and Jim Algram from the wind and water program. So catch up with them at lunch, but also when we have some questions later, I'm going to ask them to come on up and help field some of the questions as well. And talking about nonlinear pathways, and so how did I get to DOE? U.S. Geological Survey, a stint in music theory, Audubon. Then I worked in the oil and gas sector for about 30 years and came to DOE in 2011 to first run the geothermal program and then take on this renewable portfolio about a year and a quarter ago. And it came, in our family, we were having a discussion, let's go do something we've never done. And so my wife, who was at NASA, interesting background, she was an astronaut at NASA, wanted to do something she'd never done. And so now she's at an agency called DARPA and doing what she says is the coolest stuff she's ever done. And I'd argue that the stuff that we do here in this portfolio falls in that same kind of category. You talk to these people and they're doing the coolest stuff, the most exciting stuff, in many cases they've ever done in their careers. So what's our mission? How do we sort of bind these renewable technologies together? Overall, the goal is increasing generation of electricity, electrical power from renewable resources, and we do everything from basic research. We do tie into the Office of Science, basic and foundational science, but most of our time is spent in sort of this applied R&D to demonstration, sort of stepping right into the deployment space. The chart in the middle, you can see those logos. That's not meant to imply that solar is applied research and the geothermal is technology demonstration. It's just basically this is the space we live in, and for most of the things that we do, and a very, very strong underpinning of reducing greenhouse gas emissions with very, very, very aggressive targets over a very long timeline. So I'm going to take you on a little bit of a tour. I think this is going to be some slides you've seen before, but they're important to us for a variety of reasons. And yeah, I have the same illness that Ruben has, sometimes using eye charts. But I want you to look at total renewables 2004 to 2014. So about 9% to a little, actually we're pretty close to 14.1%. The rate of change here is amazing. And it's really exciting. You can see the sort of the stability in hydro. You can see the growth in solar, still sort of low on a percentage standpoint, but look at the rate of change. Wind, same thing, 0.4% to about 4.4%. Geothermal stays in its baseload power. It's a smaller piece. Staying about stable. We're really keen to see if we can't break it out of that trading zone, so to speak. Looking at this a little bit different way, both on nameplate capacity. The renewable is about 15.5% in the U.S., 13.5% of net generation. And you can see again, the hydro piece, which is a traditional generating source, is fairly stable. But again, remember the slide before, the rate of change and wind. And this is what's going on. It's almost 70,000 megawatts, 70 gigawatts of installed generation. And look at the change on that far right year on year. Sort of a compound annual growth rate type of calculation. Every now and then you see a blip, and this is a policy-related blip. This is when tax credits are no longer available. The market pays a lot of attention to that and sort of accelerates investment into this market, or sort of holds it back, waiting for, in many cases, or in some cases, renewal of these tax credits. So it's a little bit of a sort of an up and down type profile. This is going to look a lot different now that we have tax credit extensions that are basically in place. Same kind of curve going on in PV installed capacity, and I love seeing those numbers on the far right. So these are annual year-on-year growth rates of significant double digits in the 50%, 60, 70, 80% rate of change, and this is because you've got good policy, stable policy tools in place, but it's also underpinned by technology advances. And maybe one thing, I'll just sort of step back here just for a second. This ties several of the energy sectors together. There's sort of a fun report that came out I think it was about a year ago now, by McKinsey. And so it was McKinsey talking about their energy projections. I think it was sort of a 7 or 8 year sort of forward-looking projection. And McKinsey said, we are directionally correct, thinking about natural gas, PV, and wind, but we were way off on the numbers. So they didn't really anticipate the change, what happened from fracturing shales and getting natural gas out of those. They way underestimated PV. They way underestimated wind. And what's important is when we tend to look at these projections on a year-on-year basis, even with the rates that we're seeing, as sectors, we tend to underestimate the growth we're going to see. And I think there's sort of a fun dialogue there is, as we see revolutions going on, as we see change going on, we still don't actually forecast it as accurately as it tends to be happening. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what's going on in the basically sector by sector as we go through this portfolio. Sunshot goal in the solar program, the target has been getting to 6 cents per kilowatt hour, and they've made phenomenal progress, about a little bit more than 70% towards that goal already. And so you can probably look at that one of two ways. You can say, gosh, we're right on the trajectory to it, so we're probably done with solar. Is that right? The answer is no. As we look at what's happening in the market, and this is either from the grid standpoint or market competitiveness, and a big part of this is the availability of very, very cheap natural gas in the market. The program's realized a great opportunity to sort of re-gear on the technology space and start looking at what's the opportunity to get to 2 cent, 3 cent solar as compared to the prior Sunshot goal. So that's where that program's going, and they're spending the year sort of restacking that on both a market standpoint, but also importantly on a technology and foundational science standpoint. That sort of shows where they're going. program over the past number of years has had huge success in world records in the effectiveness and efficiencies of solar PV cells. A lot of this actually, it's at universities, it's at national labs. A lot of this was done at our national, the lab that we sort of own, which is NREL in Golden, Colorado. But the programs also realized that as you drive these costs down in a technology context, other things start sort of popping up. And so this is a great illustration of what the program refers to as soft costs. About 64% of the cost of a system is increasingly becoming these non-technical costs. Now, again, this is sort of benchmarked against the 6 cent number, not the 2 or 3 cent number. But if you look at these, what's in here, permitting and installation, transaction costs, installation labor, supply chain, and importantly, in many cases, time. It's not just it's not just the complexity here. It's how long does this take, and how long does this take compared to other parts of the world, and what can we do to try to accelerate, basically compress that, because time is basically in a front cost loaded environment. It trashes your economics, and so trying to get a lot faster and a lot more efficient in this is a key part of the program's goals. So this sort of gives you sort of a picture of what that challenge is like. It's not like you've got a few places you've got to figure this out. You've got 50 states, a bucket load of utilities, and almost 20,000 different jurisdictions. And the example of this, I guess, I would give is imagine two not even two neighboring towns, but two neighboring subdivisions that have entirely different construction, conventional construction codes. It means that the crew that works in one subdivision cannot work in that other subdivision because either they're not qualified, they're not trained, or they simply don't know how to do it. That typifies, in many cases, the landscape between one town, one county. This is across the United States. The challenges of trying to both drive down costs and start to do this faster. And so the program undertook this. This is back in 2012. Undertook the Solar Rooftop Challenge. The goal was to cut red tape by a week. The outcome here, you can just see just by cutting it by a week how much power ended up being installed, how many conventional PV installations there were, what this means. And the idea is that this gets sticky. This gets traction. This starts getting out in the marketplace, where more and more entities start doing this. And I know I'm spending a bunch of time on the soft cost piece of this, but it's a big part of the program. Geothermal, the enhanced geothermal systems. The program, there's been a lot of work funded by DOE over the years. Sally mentioned some of that earlier, on breaking rock or causing rock to slip, shear, basically trying to improve the permeability of heat exchange systems in the subsurface so you can extract more heat. Not short circuit the system, but just simply make the subsurface more effective. The program's had a number of demonstrations over the years, I think 5 or 6 big ones, where sort of figured how to do this in sort of a proximal environment. This is basically breaking rock, this near working hydrothermal system, and basically trying to open up more hot rock to fluid flow in the subsurface. This opens up right there by being able to open that up. That opens up another 5, 6, 7 gigawatts of opportunity in the Western U.S. just like that. And it led to thinking, what's the next big challenge? And Ruben had this slide earlier. And so the program is basically in the middle of selecting a number from a number of sites down to one site to undertake the R&D. Technology testing, everything from horizontal wells to high temperature electronics, new sensing technologies, and so on, to really make breaking rock in a reliable and environmentally responsible way a reality, so we can start actually opening up a lot more of the earth to generating power. So this is where this effort is right now. Mostly focused in the U.S. West because that's where hot rocks are close to the surface. And there are 5 sites conveniently in 5 different states. Every one of these sites is different. And so you can see the teams that are working on this right now. Every one of these is a wonderful site to do this testing. It's going to make the selection process really challenging. And about the middle of this year, this is going to go from the 5 teams down to somewhere between 1 and 3 teams, and eventually ending up selecting 1 site. And so when folks say, what's the biggest thing that scares me about this? Frankly, it's having 1 site. You know, if we think about the heterogeneity in the subsurface, having 1 site to do a bunch of R&D is both really exciting because it's going to be highly instrumented and really, really well understood. But the steps to make this so that it's replicable in lots of other parts of the subsurface, it's going to be a big challenge. This slide here, we're stepping into the wind program. The wind program this past year worked with the academic community, national labs, and importantly with industry, to try to sort of lay out what is the vision for where wind can go. Now we tend to sometimes think that the wind sector is sort of a mature technology. It's sort of centered around started to center around designs and design characteristics and such. And if you look at places in the mid-continent, and interestingly, most folks don't realize that how much wind there is in West Texas, but if you've been to West Texas, you really understand that. But this starts capturing where do we have the growth in the wind sector, where's the growth opportunity? And I'm going to see if I can go back just, yeah. So look at this, 2000, and then where does this go? So you see a lot more deployment development opportunity in various parts of the country. But importantly, look at the blue. That's offshore wind. And so we've got a lot of offshore wind in Europe. We've got demonstration projects here in the U.S. that we're working with right now. The offshore wind, because it's very close to where you've got demand. It's very close to where you've got major populations, especially on the East Coast. It's also, and I think this is very important in the energy dialogue. It goes into a somewhat different area. Offshore wind can be out of sight, or by and large out of sight. I'm not really talking about Cape Wind near Cape Cod, but if you start thinking about being 12, 16, 18 miles out, it's less visible. It's not in somebody's backyard as much. And that's an important aspect of developing this resource. And so that program's working on both fixed foundation, but one area that I think is hugely exciting is floating technology. So basically being able to put wind turbines, really large wind turbines, on floating platforms. This borrows technology from the oil and gas sector. Becomes a great opportunity. You start looking at totally different load characteristics when you're doing this. One other thing that's part of this program is, and I think it's in the next slide, yeah, is what are the other technology challenges that this sector is facing? Again, I was talking about how we tend to think of wind as being sort of mature. It's really not. One part is starting to get away from the this single turbine perspective, the single turbine fixation. I'm talking down here on the lower left, and start looking at the opportunity to have wind farms, A, better designed, and B, somewhat interactive and dynamic. The opportunity here is to have wind farms, large wind farms, about 20-30% more efficient by having basically being able to alter how you operate the field. I think some very exciting opportunities here. And how do you basically design a large wind farm from the ground up? Do you put your biggest, baddest turbines right up front where you throw massive wake effects through the rest of the farm? Or do you think counterintuitively and say, actually, we want different materials, different size turbines in different parts of a field? And then this gets even more challenging when we start going from the 2 and 3 megawatt turbines up to the 5, 6, 7, 8 megawatt turbines. They're increasingly moving into the market, both onshore and offshore. Another part of this is trying to look at taller wind. And so in the US, our average hub height is about 80 meters high. borrowing a little bit from what's going on in Europe, we're starting to look at hub heights that are going to be in the 110, 114 meter high height. So totally different materials, totally different loads, totally different operating characteristics in large wind farms. And so it also, because you're higher, you get out of the ground effect. And so you start opening up a huge part of the resource that we don't really access very, very much. The big market opportunity here is the Southeast U.S. That's where we have a lot, lower wind overall in sort of the near ground environment, but huge opportunity when you start getting at higher elevations. Water program, again, you tend to think of hydro as being a mature technology. And the answer is yes, but no, it's not really. So there's a fair amount of work on looking at non-powered dams. A lot of dams in the U.S. that are not powered. And what are the opportunity to, in an environmentally responsible way, add power to these non-powered systems, including looking at low-flow, low-head hydropower. And so you can see an example of that in the lower right, trying to look at opportunities to basically put turbines in sort of run-of-flow opportunities and start harvesting that power. Importantly, this becomes, in many cases, it's where you need the power. And so it's not centrally located power, it's a little bit more distributed. Looking at new power technologies that go into municipal power systems. And you start thinking of, when you start pushing a lot of water around, handling a lot of water in these muni systems, you actually have a fair amount of energy available, which we really don't take advantage of, and there's a large opportunity there. The couple more aspects of this. Let's see if we've, yeah. Looking at the marine and hydrokinetic part of the program. The slide on the left, it's a little bit misleading because it talks about resources, and we don't really need to get into a discussion of gross resource versus net technically available resource. But what you can see is whether it's tidal, whether it's wave energy, or in a few parts of the country, whether it's ocean currents, we've got a lot of energy offshore. And so the program has a lot of work underway on technologies. They had a wave energy prize that they're in the middle of working through right now to start looking at what are the technologies, the right technologies for harvesting energy from waves. And the best way I would characterize that would be is if you sort of cycle back probably 20 years and think of what were all the different kinds of wind energy technologies that people were trying to advance before we sort of started to settle on sort of the core technology in that space. There's a lot of different ideas out there in the market right now on how to harvest energy out of waves, and this wave energy prize, which is then going to start driving towards let's start testing these things at scale, about 1/4 to 1/10 scale, and then eventually start getting full-scale devices out in the ocean. See how do they operate. We know that scaling is a big challenge, going from basically from the wave tank in the lab to this 1/10 scale to full scale. But how do we do this? How do we basically help this technology space select itself into the most cost-effective and the most efficient devices going forward? Finally, grid modernization. Grid modernization is another one of these pretty complex crosscuts. And as I mentioned, Kevin Lynn here has sort of the central responsibility for grid integration within EERE. He has a counterpart in the Office of Electricity. If you think about the two different offices, Office of Electricity is sort of looking at the big grid space, after the meter. We're thinking sort of, before that point, but also sort of that integrated space. This is an effort in DOE that spans 12 different offices. Herding cats doesn't even come close to describing how hard this is to get different offices, different cultures, different technologies, different approaches to funding projects, reviewing and overseeing projects to all start behaving in sort of a coherent fashion. It's actually working. Everybody's starting to have the same language and pursuing sort of a set of common goals. And why is this important? the grid we've got right now, or the grid we've had, is not the grid we're going to need. And a variety of reasons for that. One of them is we've got we already have, and we're going to continue to have more and more different energy sources. Intermittent sources like solar and wind. We're going to have more distributed energy. Market opportunities. We're good. Ruben was talking about electric vehicles. Electric vehicles and buildings are a big part of the grid opportunity. Consumers are becoming producers to a certain extent. If you've got solar on your roof and you can sell it back into the market, you're sitting on both sides of that equation. That's really hard. Extreme events, which really goes to the resiliency of the grid, and sort of what we think of here is hurricanes, major storm events, and then finally security threats, which is really challenging when you start talking about making a more open and accessible grid, but making sure you really don't mess it up. Again, sort of these drivers of change, sort of push into this multi-year plan that the office spent about 2 years developing, which starts looking at major pillars or categories, and these are not exclusive pillars. Devices and integrated systems, sensing and measurement, planning tools, modeling tools. And then how do we get institutions to start changing and evolving? The institutions in many cases being the vast array and complexity of utilities. So this, one part of this then starts going into starting to do some regional demonstrations, trying to get some of these ideas, these technologies actually out there working in a connected marketplace environment. And the goal, and this is not a short-term goal, by the way. This is a very, very long-term effort, very, very long-term program that all these offices are funding, all these offices are participating in. But the prize is a grid that actually behaves well and performs in a rapidly evolving energy environment. This is just a quick snapshot. This is where these partnerships are located. And if you start thinking about the differences in, first of all, energy source, the energy characteristics in the arid Southwest is different than the energy requirements, the energy sources in the Pacific Northwest. Same thing. The Southeast is way different than the Northeast, and so on. And so this is the reason to have a number of very different, very unique partnerships scattered around the country, trying to tackle the sort of the regional changes, the regional aspects of these grid challenges. And I just wanted to put this up in just sort of to wrap up. We talk about we tend to think about U.S.-centric, the challenges we have in renewable power, renewable energy, and grid in a U.S. context. But I think it's also very, very important to think where do being able to solve these challenges, being successful at them, where do those cascade on a global scale? Because it's, yes, we use a lot of energy, but you start looking at where the world's going, and I think especially, think about energy transitions, where we've had energy transitions in many parts of the developed world, sort of wood to coal to petroleum to gas, and driving into renewables. And we have a wonderful opportunity in a lot of parts of the world to skip over major parts of those transitional changes. And we've got a world that very much wants to have the same access to affordable and easy access and reliable energy that we have. So I think it underscores sort of the role on the impact of the work that we're doing, and where that goes on a global scale, not just on sort of U.S. or North American scale. Okay, thanks. I think we got a bunch of time. So we got 10 minutes to talk. If anybody's got any questions, yeah.
Thanks for your presentation. I wondered if you could go into a few more specifics about the grid modernization.
Okay, and that's the reason I brought these guys, because I want them talking. So
one follow-up.
Yeah.
I also didn't notice grid scale energy storage in the plan, and I wonder if that's part of it too.
So Kevin, why don't you talk about grid? Yeah, yeah.
Oh, yeah. So we do have, Brian reminds me, we have a panel of 15. So, I mean, the grid storage, like, I guess your second question was around energy storage. And we definitely, we focus around the 6 different pillars we have. Devices is one of those. And our energy storage program plays a large role in that. So, you know, trying to meet targets around energy storage is a key. Can you tell me what your first question was? Yeah, maybe it'd be better because we have a whole session. Maybe that's the best time to do it.
Okay.
Kevin, I'll pitch in on this because I'm not on your panel this afternoon. One area is in looking manufacturing. The FY17 budget last week. Actually, the manufacturing office, we're working with the Office of Electricity, where they're actually proposing one of these manufacturing institutes around manufacturing issues related to grids, so we can wind up getting cost parity. So the whole area of energy storage is baked right into that, because that's where, as Kevin noted, that's part of the problem. So how you go back to cost target, how you bring technology so that we can provide a lot of these costs.
Yeah.
Do any of these plans address funding? Like, how big of a role do you see the private funding versus public funding in this?
Great question. So I didn't talk about the budget. So this is a little bit less than on an annual basis, and sort of comes and goes, about $500 million a year. The big program is solar. The smallest program is geothermal, and you know, wind sort of in the middle. Water programs are about the same size as geothermal. The programs fund national labs directly. And so we'll basically push funds through basically an annual operating plan out to the national labs. But a lot of the funding also goes to industry, and it goes to academic institutions. And in many cases, we're working with industry. We have a requirement that they provide cost share, depending upon the maturity of the technology, somewhere between 20 and 50%. And so you can see, basically, you start seeing the leverage of the portfolio is bigger than the funded amount on an annual basis. Is that?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah, wait, this minute's on. Yeah.
Yeah, well, one of your pillars seems to imply, and it's a takeoff on your question, a research activity for finance in energy. So researching how to finance the new energy and the transitional energy strategies. Can you speak to what kind of funding you're doing on the research for finance?
Really less really on the finance side, and really paying a lot more attention to the impact of technologies as they accelerate into the marketplace. But it's really not getting into the finance side. DOE does have a loan office which does a tremendous amount of work on basically the financial underpinnings of the various sectors. And that's, I'd say overall, that's where more of that research on the market dynamics by sector actually occurs as compared to the technology offices. Okay. Yeah. And then, yeah. Yes, you. Yeah.
Thank you for your presentation. How is the department working with state and local regulators to try to open and incentivize the deployment of these technologies?
In several ways, and I'll give one example that comes out of the geothermal office is a lot of geothermal energy in the this could become a really rambly question, so I'll try to keep it sort of tight. A lot of geothermal in the country is on federal lands, and the process of permitting energy projects doesn't really matter whether it's wind, solar, geothermal on federal lands can be really complex, and so the geothermal office built basically a regulatory roadmap. The goal was not to try to characterize a slow and long regulatory process. It was working with Department of Interior and a lot of other regulatory entities, including state and local, was to say, how could we do this responsibly, but also better and faster? Basically, rather than streamlining, it's really optimized the process. And so geothermal did that, and then on the heels of that, the solar program has been working on this. The wind program's been working on this, and I think that continues as an initiative in its own right. but then each of the programs also works with local and regional permitting entities to try to make sure that we're tackling, addressing the questions they might have, for example, in solar on what are the requirements that may not be appropriate for the marketplace. In the case of trying to get increased solar PV developed in Hawaii, did some work, and Brian here was very, very involved with this, working with the utility on, talking about working with technologies and the market dynamics and the grid integration characteristics that told that utility called HECO that they actually could have a lot more solar on the grid than they thought they could based upon their modeling. So that's an example of working with an entity to show that actually you can get a lot more renewable than they thought they could. Sally.
Yeah, thanks. Could you say a little bit more about your sort of strategy, technical strategy to look at reducing PV to 2 to 3 cents a kilowatt hour?
I'm going to ask Joe to do that. But part of the challenge is this is a year-long effort that they're just starting.
So yeah, as Doug mentioned, we've just kind of started the exercise on looking at how we move beyond Sunshot and really go to the next kind of benchmark or goal in terms of cost reduction. So I believe probably later this week or early next week, we're going to be releasing the On the Path to Sunshot study, which is a study that looks at kind of how we've done so far, but also will start to release some of the information, some of the plans on how we do get to 2 to 3 cents. And I think some of the ideas that have been out there and some of the shift in the more recent shift in the program's focus have been on looking at module design, looking at, again, ways that you can take new technologies and really leverage the development of the new technologies to reduce soft costs, because soft costs are actually 2/3 or even more of the cost of solar new technologies anymore. And so we're tackling soft costs both through some of the programs that Elaine Ulrich, who's my partner on the soft cost program, but also through technology and how we can leverage new technology developments to attack soft costs as well. And so we haven't put out a full plan yet. That is our exercise over the next year, but we're kind of in the early stages of working on that.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for the presentation. You mentioned that one of the big challenges was institutional regarding utilities. Could you expand on that and what you see the biggest challenges there are?
I'd say overall, I'm going to ask Kevin to add to this, but I think one of the challenges is when you look at the makeup of each utility. It's either utility specific or on a regional case. Sometimes it goes to their generation fleet that they already have and how they're evolving. I think sometimes it goes to their ability or inability to add renewables that would be above the market. And so then we start getting into, I think, sometimes very, very complex decisions of can we have can you be asking consumers to be paying more for clean energy? And sometimes it sounds like an easy question. It's a really hard question because in many cases the market comes back and says, no, we've got a great fleet, or we've got some great renewable energy already. In the case of the Pacific Northwest, makes it hard to develop new technologies into some of those spaces. So it's a region by region question, which is really sort of the foundation behind having these regional partnerships to try to tackle the unique challenges they're very characteristic of that space. I mentioned a couple of them. New England is another example, pretty densely populated. New England is facing a need for need more generation capacity. They need to bring more natural gas into the region, or they need to bring in hydro. When they talk about hydro, they're not talking about developing hydro there. They're talking about bringing hydro in from Canada, so basically co-opting part of southern Canada. But then you've got transmission challenges. So very, very unique challenge that we don't see anywhere else in the country. So, okay. I'm being told we need to wrap up, which I think means lunch, right? Okay. Okay.